Hi everybody and welcome to the Sew and Shared beginners tutorial. We get quite a lot of requests from people starting out who would like to learn to make a quilt, so we've decided to put this little video together. So to start off with, you will need a board, a cutter and a ruler. And then, of course, you'll need some fabric. So what we're going to use today is 2 meters of fabric and a fat quarter bundle. Now, to make this really easy for everybody, we have a beginner's pack on the website of the board cutter and ruler, and we also have these items on the website. And of course, you can choose your own colours, but we're going to use a fat quarter bundle. We're going to make something really simple, but something very sweet. Let's go to the cutting. So when you get your fat quarter bundle, you need to open out the fat quarters and give them just a gentle press with the iron, just to take out any creases. It's much easier to cut fabric that has no creases and it'll be more accurate. So I like to fold my fat quarter in half because I find it quite daunting to be cut a very large piece of fabric, and that way then you can see the measurements clearly on the board. So I'm putting the straight edge against the line at the start of the board, and then I'm putting the ruler so I can see it either side on the nine on the top and the bottom. Now we're going to cut the fat quarter into 2 strips of 9 inches, and then we are going to cross cut those into 9-inch squares. So from each fat quarter you will get 4 9-inch squares. So just make sure that the blade of the cutter is at a 90-degree angle to the ruler so that the ruler won't slip. And just take your time and put the cover back on the blade when you're finished. So that's the first strip done. I'm just going to put that to one side while I cut the next strip. So here I'm looking for the 9 again on the board, and I'm going to place the edge of the ruler on the line. And then I'm going to cut. And it's important to keep your fingers back from the edge of the ruler and to apply an even pressure. And if you keep the blade of the cutter at a right angle to the ruler won't slip. Make sure you give yourself plenty of room when you're cutting. Okay, so now we have 2 9-inch strips cut from the fat quarter. And there's a little bit of selvage there, so I'm just going to cut that off first. And then I'm going to cut I've put the 2 strips one on top of another. It's easier to cut 2 at once, but if you're not feeling that confident, just cut 1 at a time. And I'm just going to straighten the edge here at the edge. And then I'm going to cut the first 9-inch square from the strip. Always put the cover on the blade when you're finished. I'm going to bring the rest of the edge of this nice straight edge to the edge of the board, and I'm going to cut another 9-inch square. Put this to one side because you might use it in your scrap bin another day. So here we have, from this fat quarter now, we have 4 lovely 9-inch squares. So I'm going to repeat that process with the rest of the fat quarters. Now we have 2 meters or 2 yards, there's not much difference, of like a sort of an off-white fabric, and we're going to also cut that up into 9-inch squares. So I'm going to show you how to do that now. So I folded the fabric into a manageable size on the board, and I'm going to cut a strip across the width from selvage to selvage, but now I'm cutting through 4 layers, so it might be a little harder to cut, but if you've cut all those fat quarters up now, you should be more than ready. So I'm just going to straighten the edge Now if you have a longer ruler and you're more confident to cut the longer strip, that's all right as well. It's just whatever you're comfortable doing. So again, I'm going to cross cut the whole piece of fabric into 9-inch strips first. Lay it out on the board again and cross cut into your 9-inch squares. So we've laid the quilt out now and placed the coloured squares where we're happy with them. I've done 7 squares across and 8 squares down. Took a little while to jig it around until I was happy with it, but I think it's quite pretty, and we're ready to sew it now. So first of all, we're going to sew the squares together in rows. So this is the first row, this is the second row. So we do that by picking up the first 2 squares and taking them to the sewing machine. So we're going to set the stitch on the machine, the seam allowance, to 1/4 inch, and I'm actually using the Innovis VQ2. It's a brother sewing machine. It sort of would be more top end. So I'm selecting the stitch and I'm just going to change here so that it's going to stitch at 1/4 inch. So you can check that yourself by just using the edge of the ruler to the edge of the foot to make sure that it's at 1/4 inch before you start sewing. And most patterns and quilts that you make from a kit or whatever will presume that you're using 1/4 inch seam allowance, and they'll probably state that in the instructions. So I know that this is now set at 1/4 inch and my 2 squares are cut at 9 inches. So I need to line up the edges of the 2 squares so that they are perfectly together. So when I look at my row, that was my first square and this is the second square. So I'm just going to line these up. Now you can use a pin if you want, if it makes you feel better, but there's really no need because they're only small. Okay, so I'm just going to line up the 2 edges and line up those 2 edges with the edge of the foot because I know that's my 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to start sewing. Just going to speed that up a little bit. It's a bit slow for me, but this machine has got an automatic thread cutter, and if anybody's ever thinking of buying a machine, that to me would be the most important thing. Okay, so my first 2 squares are now stitched together. So I'm going to leave these here because I know this is number 1 and this is number 2, and then I'm going to get the 3rd square and I'm going to attach it the same way. Okay, so when you're ironing the seams of your blocks, you just need to iron very gently along. And you'll know I'm pressing the seams all in one direction. I'm just putting a little bit of pressure from underneath to make sure that each piece is flat. And just turn it over then, and all the seams are facing that way. So I'm just going to then run over the top of the seams to make sure there's no pockets, to make sure all the fabric is out, because that can really make a difference then when you're sewing them together. Now we do the same with the next row, but don't forget to put the seams in the opposite direction. Okay, so I've got my first two rows. The first row is on the bottom and the second row is on the top. And if you look, the seams are ironed in opposite directions, so when you put the seam together, they sort of lock together, and that helps you with keeping your seams together when you're sewing the strips. Okay, so I've lined the seams up first. I'm just making sure they're interlocking, and then using my 1/4 inch, I'm going to sew row 1 and row 2 together. So I'm just checking that my seams are still interlocking. And I'm not afraid to stop and keep aligning. You can do that as much as you want. Okay, so I'm going to make sure now that these are ironed in opposite directions. They are, and I'm just pulling them in together to make them fit. And I'm going to continue along the strip sewing these in the same manner until row 1 and row 2 are together, and then I'll add row 3 and 4 and so on until the whole quilt is together. Now that's the quilt all together in one piece. Now don't worry about if your seams aren't exact. If it's your first quilt, that's going to happen, and what you've got to remember is you made it. So well done if you've got this far. Now once you've made the top, you have to quilt it. There's so many different options for quilting that what we're going to do is, if you buy the beginner's quilt kit pack off the website, there will be instructions and follow-up instructions on where to look and how to find out how to quilt it. Your options are you can quilt it yourself, or if you live in Ireland you can send it to us. We do long arm quilting. You can hand quilt it. There's lots of different ways you can finish off your quilt, but you've got this far and that's absolutely fantastic. It's a nice little pretty quilt. It would fit a single bed, or it's a nice throw. So just enjoy it and finish it off, and put some wadding and some backing, and you'll need some binding. And I hope you've enjoyed making this project. It's nice and simple and it's great to start off with, and I hope you go on to make many more quilts. Thank you for watching.